Robert Eggers' feature debut, The Witch, is among my favorite films of all time. He has a signature style of storytelling where it's mysterious, dark, and at times slightly overwhelming, but I mean that in the best way possible. Because of how rich in atmosphere and dialogue intensive his movies are, it's overwhelming because it's not often movies have those features, so it's that infrequency of that type of movie that he always nails and as such always feels extremely immersive. And while his films are eerie and uncomfortable, there's always this undertone of raw humanity and madness at play with his characters. His characters are never presented as perfect, and that sensibility and realism really just immerses you and lets you connect with their emotions. Personally, The Witch is one of my favorite films because I just felt like Thomason's emotional journey was really compelling, and I found the ending to be quite cathartic. And I absolutely adored The Lighthouse because it's a perfect illustration of what the madness and absurdity of the human mind can be. So it goes without saying, I'm a massive fan of Robert Eggers, and I was extremely excited when it was announced that he was going to be taking on the monumental task of having his own iteration of Nosferatu. Riddled with issues, Nosferatu has a toxic background to say the least, since the original 1922 version was based off Bram Stoker's 1897 novel Dracula. Basically, Bram's widow didn't give permission for them to make a Dracula movie and effectively destroyed the film. Luckily, the film survived due to good old-fashioned rule ignoring. Essentially, people really didn't want the movie to be deleted from existence, so they salvaged it. Fast forward to 2024, while the title Nosferatu is famously known and referenced, most people probably haven't seen the actual film outside of its pop culture references, especially since a lot of people may not know it's a silent film, which for most audiences is a bit incomprehensible and unreachable since most people don't have experience with silent storytelling type films in general. The original film is largely told through body language and large text boxes that say what the characters are trying to say, and music that's supposed to evoke the feeling that you're supposed to be feeling in that scene. For the better part of the last couple of decades, vampire movies have been on low demand. Things like Fright Night and The Lost Boys are excellent films, but they're older, even though they do very much hold up till this day. Since the early 2000s, true vampire flicks, not including the Twilight series, have been largely unsuccessful and therefore forgotten. And that's quite sad, because it's not like there haven't been good attempts made. Hell, Renfield, which funnily enough also stars Nicholas Hoult, was quite good but did poorly in the box office, and even this year's Abigail was fun as hell but again didn't do nearly as well as it should have, tragically. Personally, while I'm not a huge fan of the vampire subgenre, I do hope that Nosferatu makes enough of a splash to convince people to start giving some love to that subgenre, especially considering that Nosferatu is an excellent palate cleanser for those that think that vampire cliches ruin any new vampire flicks. And I'm of the opinion that this movie is a masterclass mood piece. It's largely faithful to the original material, following all of the major points of the original film, but presents it in new, dark, creative ways. And because of how faithful it is, the story is as simple as you'd think it'd be. A man goes to close a real estate transaction at Count Orlok's mansion, unbeknownst to him that it's all a scheme for Count Orlok to enamor his wife and make her his. The difference being that this is Robert Eggers we're talking about, so of course it's gonna be a period piece with dated language, it's gonna have anachronistically corrected wardrobe, and it's gonna have slower pacing as well. So even though the story is very familiar, it's gonna be presented in a way that only he knows how to do. Visually, this movie is unforgettable. Across the board, I loved the production and set design as we moved to so many different locations, and even when we were spending more time in certain spots, we got to discover new zones of it. Count Orlok's mansion was plucked straight out of a Resident Evil game with its gothic, dark, and cold aesthetic. The lighting and color palette that were used just augmented the emotions that I felt like the film had captured perfectly. The blues and grays provided a hauntingly cold texture to the movie. Shadows and shading not only helped keep the atmosphere offsetting and cold, but it also allowed for some neat camera tricks and editing. I'm devastated that they included the shot of Count Orlok's hand engulfing the city, since it's easily my favorite shot of the movie, but I can't even be that mad mad at them for including it in the trailer, since I know they were definitely so proud of that shot, so at that point just flex it. They were able to flesh out the magical, ethereal feel much more in this film that made it very clear that there is supernatural elements, as opposed to in the original there wasn't that much of it. Multiple times throughout the movie, shadows of hands would force you to track the shadow as it would open doors even though nobody physically touched the door. There was neat lighting tricks that would make it go from night to day so seamlessly, or transitions through time skips which helped you accept the presence of magic in this world. There were plenty of sequences that felt almost mesmerizing because of how dreamlike they felt. In particular in the woods when Nosferatu sent a carriage for Hutter even though there was no driver. The wardrobe, oh my god, I was obsessed with the wardrobe, which isn't surprising since I loved it in The Witch. Eggers really shows a lot of love to the wardrobe in his movies. The balloon sleeves on all the dresses, the giant ties on the guys' suits, or the exaggeratedly thick sideburns. It was all some fun stuff. In particular, I loved that for the first half, for various characters, but especially Ellen, was wearing flower-like patterns on all her clothing, and in context, the fact that when Nosferatu describes the smell of Ellen's hair as lilac like the flower, or Ellen asking Thomas, why have you killed these flowers, foreshadowing the future events, it's just brilliant. I think this is by far the biggest scope Eggers has tackled, with the biggest environment, with the most amount of moving pieces, especially since we'd seen him in these tiny isolated locations with not much movement to other locations. And the cast for this film was outstanding. Across the board, everybody was fully invested in their roles. I'm a little worried that Knock, played by Simon McBurney, is gonna get overlooked in this, since while, yes, his character is meant to be just a pest, he feels so engrossed in the role. He was amazing. The film made sure you understood how devoted he was to Count Orlok. The dude literally ate live goats, bit the head off of a pigeon just to prove how deranged he was. And Thomas, played by Nicholas Hoult, was a great surrogate. I love that Eggers always writes his characters to be flawed in very real, human-like ways. And Thomas is no exception. When there's decisions that you can't help but question because it's either ignorance or even through the manipulation of Nosferatu, he hurries into action when you'd think he should take a second to really think about it. But it's those same flaws that made him feel human. No one in the right mind would sign a document by a stranger when even the stranger is telling you that it's written so you can't understand it unless you're as desperate as he was in that situation. In a way, Thomas reminds me of Pedro from When Evil Lurks, because you quickly realize you feel bad for him because you know things aren't gonna end well for him. Lily Rose Depp, I think, was by far the most complex character in this film and had the biggest change in terms of being compared to her original counterpart. The number one reason being that she is an actual character in this film. It's a bit of a stretch to say that Ellen was an actual character in the original film outside of just the sad wife that wants her husband to come back home. And that's not so much of a criticism of the film as it is just a product of the time it was made in. This story is dependent on her character, and she quite literally is the crux of the film. In Eggers' version, there's so much more to work with, since right away we got a connection to why Nosferatu is infatuated with her. Her calling out to someone to comfort her, only to then have that call be answered not by a good force, but by evil himself, is a simple way of connecting the two. And in general, I'd only seen Lily Rose Depp in The Idol, which I'm glad that didn't define her acting potential, since this was a strong performance from her. Juggling fear, horniness, and the exhausting state of being tormented is no small feat. And she's the owner of probably my favorite monologues in the film, when she's talking to Thomas about her dream of when they were married, and then it's a twisted version of it where everybody's dead and she's actually married to Death himself, and she's actually happy. Her confrontation with Thomas about his letters and how he basically wasn't as present as she would have liked was such an amazing and effective scene, while also being an internal battle of who's in the driver's seat between her and Nosferatu. But on top of that, she had to do so much physical acting, like the Exorcist-like scene with her body contortions and their minor facial distortions with her tongue, her cheeks, and her eyes. It had to look so uncanny but also real at the same time. She was just fantastic, and this was very much a statement on her own behalf behalf to take her seriously as an actor. And she paired along with Bill Skarsgård as the titular Nosferatu, who was amazing as well. With Colin Farrell and Mia Goth being the other examples of this type of transformation, we've gotten to such mastery of makeup effects where you can literally erase the face of the actor to the point where you cannot tell who is actually acting in that role. The makeup effects team deserves recognition for their work in this film, because you're lying if you say that you can see Bill Skarsgård in this film. Like, going into this film, we know he's Pennywise, but he's got such a memorable face, and the fact that he was completely unidentifiable in this film was insane. And I love that for a good chunk of this movie, you can't see him clearly. It's very much silhouettes or suggested imagery that makes you think you know what you're looking at, but you actually don't get a really clear shot of him until much later on. I thought it was a great way to tease his look, and once we actually do get to see him, he's repulsive, like a rotten sack of flesh. It's amazing. And you add in an overmodulated voice to completely disguise his original voice, and you've completely created a new monster. But outside of his look, his presence was imposing and overbearing because of his sheer size and aura. He was menacing, but I'm glad they didn't make him into a flashy, over-the-top evil maniac, because for a story like this, that really wouldn't have worked. He's manipulative, and because of his power of suggestion, you buy his allure. His dialogue is intense, it's never wasted, and it's never without purpose. He carries himself as if he knows he's more powerful than you, so it helps you understand the fear that everybody feels. And I definitely do think that Max Schreck would be very proud of his successor. It helps too that this movie's dark as hell. Not only just the lust-pain juxtaposition really worked for me, but you feel the magnitude of the danger that Nosferatu poses. And this movie isn't afraid to push some boundaries. Animal death, death of unborn children, sacrifice of the loyal are all well within the range of Nosferatu. And personally, I think the pacing was very solid for the film. You'd have moments of Thomas and Ellen doing things, then it would switch to Nosferatu doing something, and it'd go back and forth like that until the end credits roll. An extremely important element of the original 1922 version was the music, and in Robert Eggers' version, it's extremely evocative and very well done. Especially towards the climax where the music like swells in like a victorious chime, but it has the faintest hint of a melancholic note where it's almost sad as well. It's just really good. And personally, I felt the theme of sacrifice and willpower to be very cathartic and very realistic. It's fitting that Ellen found a way to take control of her story and change it to where it's a different interpretation of willingness of sacrifice. She found atonement and, by her choice, was able to stop Nosferatu. She unknowingly called upon his curse, and because of that, there was an undertone of guilt that she felt like only she could resolve. All while the film manages to be really funny. If you've watched the original, half the time, yes, Nosferatu is this tall, menacing presence, but it'll cut to like a goofy shot of him carrying a coffin across a lawn in the most ridiculous way. Here, Eggers does a similar thing with Nosferatu sucking on Thomas's chest with stylized, dramatic shots, and then it'll have a stark cut to just a frontal shot with no music of Nosferatu just humping him. This film certainly does fun, creative things, with ultimately the only major thing holding it back is predictability because of how known it is. And that's unfortunately just inevitable when you have a title as big as this one. There was only so much Eggers could do without you knowing where this is gonna go. Regardless, while this isn't my favorite Eggers film, which it's gonna take a lot for a movie to dethrone The Witch for me, the gothic nightmare Nosferatu is an excellent film that's earned its title. But that's it for me. I'd appreciate a thumbs up, subscribe, and sincerely yours, Anthony.